Let us continue with our lecture. So now we are going to look at some disaster trends or some major issues that seem to have commonality with regards to disasters across the globe. And the first one we will look at is that the overall numbers of people affected by disaster is rising. Now this is something that is this is essentially true across the globe, from third world countries to developed countries, from countries in the temperate zone to countries in the moderate temperature zones. And what happens is, as the numbers of people affected by disasters increase, you find that there will be an increasing need for food, water, defense, and access to money and finances. These are essentials in terms of disaster relief. For what happens is, oftentimes when a disaster strikes, starting from that emergency period, as we've said before, that intense period of emergency, going onwards, there would be a great need for many of these resources, because people may have lost everything. They may have lost their homes and all their possessions, etc. The risk of disaster has also been increasing, and as the risk increases, the numbers of people will be affected. Many of the reasons for this increase in risk will be discussed in points further along, but these may include things like climate change, environmental degradation, etc. In addition, the increase in the number of human settlements developing in disaster-prone areas would also put an increasing number of people at risk, such as settlements developing along floodplains, in coastal areas, along volcanic slopes, etc. These are all high-risk areas. An IMF report in 2012 indicated that more than 450 million people had been affected by disasters. That's a lot of people. Now, if you would just follow briefly with me these two charts, you don't have to worry too much about the individual colored lines. We are just looking at the trend of those lines. So if you follow with me in figure 1 shows us that the population in large cities exposed to cyclones, so that would be, for example, hurricanes, increased from 310 to 680 million between 2000, and is expected to increase to that number by 2050. This is according to the World Bank reports of 2009. So they would have taken all the historical reports, and based on the trends they would have projected to 2050. And if you look at those lines, regardless of the color, you can see a progressive increase from 1970 all the way to 2050. So that is the number of cities with large populations exposed to cyclones. If we look at figure 2 at the bottom, this one shows us the population of large cities exposed to earthquakes for the same period, increasing from 370 to 870 million. And again, we can see a gradual increase in some instances, and in others it seems to be almost exponential increase. So we are seeing an increase in the number of cities and the numbers of people being exposed to some of these natural disasters, such as hurricanes and earthquakes. Additionally, we can also see overall disasters are becoming less deadly. Human beings are essentially adaptable and are able to quickly adjust to pressures, even environmental pressures. People will often have to modify their behavior and their surroundings in order to accommodate for climate and topographic changes. Topography meaning the landscape itself. As a result, you also find, as part of this adaptation, globalization, meaning an increase in the connectivity amongst different nations and an increase in international cooperation. All of these things work together to facilitate a reduction in the risk in terms of reducing the numbers of fatalities from disasters. Now, this by no means mean that disasters are decreasing. It simply means that the effects of the disasters on human life is reducing. Again, a United Nations report from 2004 indicates that since 1970, the number of people worldwide who have perished, has fallen by 50% since the 1970s. Prior to that, it was significantly higher. Another trend we're looking at is the fact that disasters are actually becoming more costly. Where you have large groups of people concentrated together, living together in urban centers, where you have large infrastructure, expensive infrastructure, not only expensive buildings but large bridges, highways. You also have communication technology, cell towers, electrical grids, etc. These things are very expensive, and they're also in the path of hazards. Just imagine a massive hurricane or a massive earthquake hitting one of these regions. It can cause a lot of infrastructural damage, not only to harm people but to destroy your infrastructure, and your economy could be seriously affected. We have seen this happen recently as the hurricane season of 2017, where we have seen islands such as Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean seriously affected. Entire island of Barbuda being destroyed. Destruction in Puerto Rico. Even to this date, they have not been able to fully recover their infrastructure, and many people are still suffering. So as a result, we can truthfully say disasters are becoming more costly. If you have a brief look with me at this chart, we can see, I hope you can see my cursor. If you look down here at the bottom of the bottom right of the chart that shows you Chile, you can actually see in Chile in the year 2010 there were apparently, as a result of earthquakes and tsunami, 520 deaths occurred. But when you look at the cost in terms of damage, it costs $31 billion. Let's have a look at Japan. 2011, almost 16,000 deaths, $210 billion in damage. What I would like you to note as well, though, in terms of disasters and the cost, cost would not only be with regards to cost in terms of damage, but you would also have to take cost into consideration with regards to preparation and pre-planning for disasters. Another important trend to note is that poor countries are disproportionately affected by disaster consequences. Disasters do not differentiate. Poor countries, rich countries, everyone can be faced with disasters. But oftentimes what happens is the poor countries would suffer the greatest impact, and that is usually because they are least equipped, or they have the least capacity as a result of being poor in order to cope with the onslaught of any disaster or any hazardous event. Note, between 1980 and 2000, 53% of the deaths related to disasters globally actually occurred in poor countries. But interestingly, these poor countries only accounted for 11% of the global population at risk. So there, as I said, even rich countries can have populations at risk. However, the impact would be different. I gave the example of Chile versus Haiti already. Both countries were at risk to earthquake disasters, yet the impact on the two countries was significantly different. Poor countries are often least able to afford strong housing, so that increases their risk. They often live in higher risk areas, that is, areas that are not suitable for housing, such as floodplains, along coastal areas where storm surges could take place. And additionally, they are often not educated or informed about the appropriate actions that they need to take in order to secure themselves, their families, and their homes and their belongings. Look with me at this map of World Risk Index of vulnerability to natural disasters. So if you look at this map, we will see that the majority of the areas colored between yellow to orange seem to be in countries that are third world countries, in other words, poor countries. Those where the vulnerability index is low seem to be richer countries to the north. For example, some of the poorer countries we would find would be Caribbean countries, places in India, China, and many of the African countries. Whereas the richer countries, which according to this map seem to have lower vulnerability risk, would be North America and many parts of Europe, Russia, etc. However, I would like to note that even in recent times there have been increasing trends where some of the countries considered to have low risk or low vulnerability seem to be exposed to hazards that they had not been previously exposed to. For example, you see hurricanes reaching far north along the eastern seaboard of North America. There have been recent instances where these hurricanes have even diverted across the Atlantic Ocean to reach as far as the UK. So things are actually changing and it has become quite unpredictable. Additionally, we can say that the number of disasters are increasing each year. Statistics show the annual number of significant interactions between man and nature resulting in a loss of life and damage to property have increased. Many of the reasons attributed to these increasing numbers are climate change phenomena, such as global warming. Where we have global warming, we find that the ice caps are melting. We have sea level rise, where sea level rise occurs. Small island states like the Caribbean are at risk for our coastlines being drowned. Then we have environmental degradation that increases the risk of disaster, such as deforestation and soil erosion that can lead to landslides, flooding, etc. Additionally, as mentioned before, we have an increase in human settlement occurring in vulnerable areas, which as a result will increase the risk of disaster. Again, if we look at this chart, which shows natural catastrophes worldwide for the period 1980 to 2010, the red line shows events such as earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. The green line would be weather, storms, hurricanes, etc. Blue would be things like landslides, floods, and the orange or yellow would be things like drought, forest fires, etc. And we can clearly see for that period that there is a continuous increase in those number of events happening globally. Now I would like to look briefly at some of the major causes of disaster. This schematic just simply summarizes for us where we have poverty, lack of awareness and information, war and civil strife, ungoverned population growth, rapid urbanization and migration, and environmental degradation. We will look at each of these in turn very briefly. Poverty. Impoverished people or poor people often lack education, so they don't have access to education. They don't have they are not aware of how, as we said previously, how to prepare and safeguard themselves against the, how should we call it, attacks of nature. They don't have access to the proper resources, financial resources, in order to secure their homes, to stockpile emergency supplies, etc. And they also don't have political clout in order to cope with hazards, meaning, for example, they often don't have the ear of the decision makers to hear the plight of their needs. Additionally, ungoverned population growth can often lead to uncontrolled settlements developing in hazardous areas. So for example, we're talking about an increase in squatter settlements. Squatter settlements often rise up in areas that are very susceptible to hazards, such as along hillsides, etc. In addition to which, these kinds of settlements often are not well prepared. For example, they don't have proper infrastructure, such as proper drainage, such as piped borne water, etc. So we can have disasters that are not only disasters such as landslides, flooding, etc. You can have public health disasters occurring in these areas as well. Rapid urbanization and migration. So the rural poor tend to move to the metropolitan areas in search of opportunity. They're looking for jobs, they're looking for security, education, access to social infrastructure, better health care, etc. But what happens is, when they come in such large numbers, the resources of these urban areas are overwhelmed, that they are not able to provide. The government and administration not able to provide for this influx of these large numbers. And what is happening in many parts of the world right now is these numbers are not only coming from rural areas, they're coming from other countries, and this in itself can result in a man-made disaster, even as I mentioned before, in public health issues, etc. Environmental degradation can often lead to disasters. Many disasters are either caused or exacerbated by environmental conditions. For example, you may have overgrazing of the land, which depletes the land of the very thing, the vegetation that secures the soil and binds the soil to keep it together, to prevent excessive runoff of rainfall that leads to flooding. Additionally, this can lead to drought, it can lead to famine, etc. Other types of environmental degradation can lead to, for example, chemical pollution of our waters. When our waters are polluted, remember, human beings, animals, we need the water to survive. We need water that is safe for drinking. So this in turn can lead to other disasters occurring, such as health issues, etc. Lack of awareness and information can also lead to disasters. People are often most vulnerable when they are not educated on how to get out of harm's way. For example, they don't know what to look for when a tsunami is coming. So they would be taken by surprise. They would be unprepared. They don't know how to take protective measures to protect their property from flooding. They don't know what to do when an earthquake comes. So lack of awareness and information is a major cause of disasters. War and civil strife often results in disasters. Loss of human life, damage to property, entire economies can be destroyed as a result of war. We see that happening in many parts of the world right now, which is often leading to mass migration from some regions of the world out into other areas of the world. And as mentioned before, when that happens, the receiving country can come under pressure. Political and economic instability are often either the cause of or a consequence of this kind of hazard. So this concludes our lesson for this week. I want to thank you for your time, and I would like to ask you to please proceed to the activities for this week. Thanks again.